Okay, on this video, we're going to talk about your body cavities. And so a cavity is basically just an opening or hole. Think of cavity in your tooth. And so this opening or hole is a place for your organs to be. So we're going to start, and if you've got your page up, you can label with me here, but I'm going to just kind of hide part of it and just talk about it. And so we know that dorsal means back. So in the back part of your body, you have the overall dorsal cavity, back, okay, and that can be broken into two subcategories. So this is the overall, which is the dorsal cavity. So the dorsal cavity can be broken down into two smaller cavities, which is up here, which is where your skull would be, where you, more specifically I should say, is where your brain would be, hopefully. This is your cranial cavity. Cranial cavity is up here in your skull region, your cranial region. And then along in the middle of your spinal cord, spinal column, where your spinal cord goes through, there's a hole there, and that is your vertebral cavity. So in here, your spinal cord would go. This is a hole that's in between your vertebra, and then it leads up to your brain. So your brain is here in the cranial cavity, and then coming on down here would be your vertebral cavity, which houses your spinal cord. All right, we're going to move on over. So in your back, you had that dorsal cavity, and it was broken to the cranial and the vertebral cavity. So in your front, you have the ventral cavity. So that should make sense, ventral cavity. It is broken into two cavities itself. It's broken into the thoracic cavity and the abdominal pelvic cavity. So ventral can be broken into two subdivisions as well, the thoracic and the abdominal pelvic cavity. Now this has a very distinct division, and the division between these two cavities is your diaphragm. The diaphragm, so everything that is superior to your diaphragm is the part of the thoracic cavity. We're talking about in your trunk area, and then everything below that is your abdominal pelvic cavity. All right, so we're going to continue. And this is just labeling those cranial and vertebral cavity again, so you can see that it's still there, even though it's more housed towards the back, but that is for this labeling purposes. Okay, so here is our diaphragm right here, and I'm hiding part of those words, but we'll get to those in just a second. And so anything lower or inferior to that diaphragm is the abdominal pelvic cavity. So down here is the abdominal pelvic cavity, and that is both of them combined. So if we ask for both of them, what's this whole thing here called? It is the abdominal pelvic cavity. So this whole thing here, ventral. Down below it, abdominal pelvic. And I'm stressing that because I don't see if you can tell, but this is a kind of a reddish pinkish color and a kind of a greenish. This is going to be subdivided into two cavities as well. It's kind of like those nesting dolls where one's inside of the other, etc. So this can be broken down a little bit further into, and let's see if this makes sense. Let me move this up so you can see. Oh, it's broken into the abdominal, which is where your stomach and stuff is, and your pelvic cavity, your pelvis, right? So your abdominal pelvic, which is the entire thing, can be subdivided into the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity. Okay, so let me put something here. I could have drawn another, see if I can get it to draw here. So everything here, this part here, because this is ventral, this is the abdominal pelvic, and your diaphragm, oh, I did not mean to grab that. Your diaphragm is sitting right here. This is where your diaphragm is, right below your lungs to help you breathe. That's your diaphragm. And so everything superior to that is the thoracic cavity. And then below that is the abdominal pelvic. If I'm asking for this upper part of that, that's the abdominal, and that's the pelvic. All right, so this is where it gets a little bit more confusing for students. So let me get out of the curtain here. If you want to pause this video so that you can write these words down, you pause the video. Okay, so I wanted to show you, here is where your diaphragm sits. It sits right here, right below the lungs, and that is the dividing thing. So this picture here is pointing to what looks like a lung, but it's really talking about all of this whole thing above is the thoracic cavity. I labeled it over here, but they labeled it there. In the thoracic cavity, you have two other cavities that have kind of some important organs. You have your heart. Heart sits right here in the center of your chest area, a little bit more towards the left, but that is called the pericardial cavity. Peri means around, cardio heart, so the cavity around the heart. So that's the pericardial cavity. Now, on a serous membrane video, if you've watched that, you know that this has two-layer membrane, and this is actually in between the membrane, but then your heart sits in there. Okay, the pericardial cavity, if I'm looking for that opening where the heart would be. And sitting in here would be your lungs. Your left lung would be here and your right lung would be there, and that is known as the pleural cavity. Okay, so your pleural cavities have your lungs, your pericardial cavity has your heart, and then this says mediastinum, and it's pointing to this up here. It's very misleading, but your mediastinum is actually all of this area. See if I can highlight it. And if I color it, it's everything I'm coloring yellow. Mediastinum is not really a cavity, it's just a location in your body. The mediastinum is up in the thoracic cavity. It's everything but your pleural cavity, which is where your lungs are located. So what's mediastinum? Everything but your lungs up in that thoracic cavity. All right, there's all our cavities, and if you have any questions, please feel free to ask.